You know what this looks like? Oh look, a plain cardboard box. No, this is exciting though. This is a $325 after tax, after shipping battery. I'm curious to see if it lives up to its claims. So first glance, this battery is fairly large for the capacity that it is. This is a 12.8 volt, 100 amp hour lithium iron phosphate, which is a fairly common size, such as seen with battle-born batteries. So this guy is about 7 inches deep, 13 inches wide, and just a hair under 10 inches tall. Obviously the 14.4 to 14.6 volt max, which nicely lines up with your lead acid voltages, and it's one of the reasons to use lithium iron phosphate. Maximum charge of 50 amps, discharge of 100 amps. That's fairly common with a peak of 200 amps. Now it has the charge temperature protected at 0 degrees Celsius, which is what you need for lithium iron phosphate batteries. That's one of the things you don't get typically with an inexpensive 12 volt battery like this, is your low temp cutoff. This thing's currently listed for $299, and that's unheard of at that price range that I've seen anyway. Now, the things that I'm gonna test with this, I mentioned some of them. The fact that it's 100 amp hours, we're gonna check that. With lithium iron phosphate, you should be able to test to 100 to 105 amp hours on a brand new battery. So we're gonna do a discharge capacity test, and we're gonna test that it can do 100 amps continuous. So the idea is it'll be able to do 100 amps for an hour straight. So if we could at least get 20 or 30 minutes and things aren't shutting down, then we're good there. The other thing that they claim here is that these are actually cylindrical cells, just like battle-born uses, or what battery hookup is using for their 100 amp hour cell packs that you can build batteries with. This does come with a warranty. I think it was listed as 5 years, and we have our battery capacity and voltage display. I'm not gonna trust that the capacity meter on here works. It's probably based purely on voltage. So it's showing 13.3 volts and that's 93% charged, which could very well be true, or it could be that that's at 50%, considering the super flat discharge rate of these. But I mean, it's kind of nice to be able to see the voltage right on there. All right, well, we're all connected to our solar charge controller here. While we're getting some voltage, we're not getting any wattage, and that's because while we're still in bulk charging mode, there is not enough sun outside. It's kind of required for solar. We'll let this get charged up and come back to our testing. All right, so we've got it plugged in here, charging. It's just about full, but what we're seeing is that we're hitting high voltage cutoff is what it looks like. So we hit 14.5 volts, and you'll see here it'll spike up to 16, 17 volts and then come right back down again. There it goes, 17 volts, back down again, 14.5. So I've currently got this set to, say here, 14.6 volts. So we're gonna set this down to 14.4, which would be the lower side of what they're saying is max. Turn off my solar, and then I will unplug the charge controller and plug it back in. Just how you gotta reset the pound mister. And then come back in here and verify. It didn't change. Let me try that again. There we go, 14.4 volts. We'll turn the solar back on. And it looks like we're doing it again. Let me get my multimeter out here. Yep. So we're hitting that. So we're at 14.4. And then watch, it'll creep up and then hit 17 volts. So that's not good. We don't want to be hitting high voltage cutoff. So I'd have to keep lowering this until it's not hitting high voltage cutoff. But we're gonna use it as is and see what kind of capacity we get. So let's do a discharge capacity test on this. Here we are performing the standard 0.2C discharge test, and we'll see here that we reach 111 amp hours, which is amazing. And then we're going to tear apart the battery and get to our low temperature cutoff test. Conveniently, they've got some holes in here with rubber plugs that have a T15 hole in them. So we're going to try and get those out along with the 3/16 for the handle back here and see if the battery will just pull apart. You know what this looks like? It's cylindrical cells, which of course is supposed to be like Battleborn. Who else advertises that they have cells like Battleborn? Would be Battery Hookup, who has put together modules that are probably bought from the same place that Battleborn buys their cells. These look like the same modules that Battery Hookup sells. Now I'm really curious to pull these out and find out if they've got any labeling on them that indicates they are from Battery Hookup. They could just be from the same source that Battery Hookup gets them. This is gonna be fun. So they've got double 8 gauge wire running from the terminal down to the battery on the positive side and the terminal down to the BMS. Double 8, that seems sufficient for 100 amps. It also seems to be the high temp silicone type wire, which is good. Between the cells, between the packs of cells, I guess you would call them, it is 12 gauge, and there's what, 5 of them? 5 12 gauge wires, and then they go down to 2 8 gauge wires. So that seems fine. The BMS definitely says 100 amp on it. Does not appear to have Bluetooth or anything on it, which is fine. They didn't advertise it as that. I do see what appears to be a temperature sensor coming off of here, possibly 2. Oh, there's 2 temperature sensors right there. Those weren't connected to anything. Not sure about that. But then this white one, I don't know, maybe that's something different. I guess we'll see here in a minute. The white one is a different type of wire, so maybe that's not a temperature sensor, but this one's definitely glued against the battery, whereas these were just stuffed down into the shrink wrap of the battery. So it appears, and we'll see once I get it further out, that each of the 4 cells, if you will, are shrink wrapped, and then those 4 are then shrink wrapped together as one big unit. You can tell they've got the cell holders, the plastic cell holders that are holding each. There's probably like 20 individual like 5 amp hour cells. I'd have to add that up, but that'd be about right, 20 times 5. So BMS, yeesh. I don't know. I'm gonna have to take it off and see if there's anything underneath. Usually BMSs have Mosfets that are up against a heat sink, or at least like a plate of aluminum or something. And this has a cover on it, but it's flimsy, it's not metal, and the Mosfets appear to just be into the open air. I mean, at least there's some air in them, and here it's not just like, you know, closed up in the sense that there's not, you know, batteries pushing up against it, but I don't see a good heatsink for them. I'm wondering about the 100 amp continuous on this. I'm wondering if this BMS is gonna overload. There is actually a heating plug on this BMS, which is interesting. I'm curious if that would actually be able to be used. If you put a heating pad in here and plug that in, if that's programmed in the BMS, it might not be in the software. So, and then there's a bunch of markings on the top here indicating, you know, lithium iron phosphate and how many S battery and charging continued current. None of that is marked. So I have no idea if this BMS is spec'd the way it's supposed to, other than the name up here, which does say 100 amp, and it's obviously a 4S BMS with its 5 sense leads coming out. So I don't know, let's break the glue on this and see if it'll come apart. Let's see what this BMS looks like under the covers here before we take everything else apart. BMS is being held in with this white goopy glue stuff. I go back and forth on using glue for something like this because there's definitely glues that are good and will last just as long as a fastener. I don't want to discount that. I just did a video recently. I did an install on a van and used some 3M adhesive tape to attach something on the roof of a bus, and that stuff, I don't think I could have gotten it off if I wanted to. I haven't had that experience much with a double stick tape kind of a thing, so certainly don't want to discount it. Okay, so these appear to be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 Mosfets here that control the charge and discharge function, cutoff functions. All your power is going to flow from the battery through these and into your wires here. It appears that there is a temperature sensor of sorts up on top, but it's almost, I'm not sure if it's a temperature sensor or if it's like a circuit breaker. It's so big. I don't want to take this one off the BMS because that's stuck down with tape. But when I get in here, I want to take this one out. I'll see if there's got a part number on there. I'm gonna go ahead and start taking this apart a little bit more. Yeah, there's definitely nothing below the BMS, so it's just what's on top here. Let me compare that to a BMS that I've got sitting over here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Compared to this is a 120 amp BMS, and it's got, as you can see, Mosfets on both sides, and then these nice thick aluminum plates to dissipate the heat, and that's 120 amps. Much beefier than what we're seeing in this battery. All right, so now becomes the question of how do I actually get this apart? Because of course they've got this glue in here, and I would like to be able to get the battery out to find out if there's any labeling on these guys. And I can always get myself some glue to put it back together, you know? Here we go. There's a piece of foam under the BMS, right here and right here, but there are no Mosfets under there. So just these ones up top, and there's no labeling on the Mosfets, so no idea what the rating is on those. Let's cut open the shrink wrap. Okay, so here's this sensor doohickey. It says JAFLY 2105-02B. It's got 65 degrees Celsius on it. That tells me that it's some sort of a switch. So I bet you if either the BMS or the battery hits 65 Celsius, if there's an additional shutoff. What I'm worried about, I'm not worried about the battery. That's not gonna hit 65 Celsius under normal use unless there's a real failure scenario. That BMS might hit 65 if we're trying to do a 100 amp draw, and we'll find out because we're gonna do that. So they've actually got max charge and discharge as 100 amps. The casing saying 50 amps is probably limited by the BMS, which is fine. Typically with the unit, you would have 100 amp, 50 amp. Just because you do half C with the cylindrical cells, you can typically do higher, and that's why the cells are rated for 100 amps. I know with the battery hookup modules that are like this, they do 100 and 100, and that's because the nickel tabbing and the wires are rated for 100 amps, even though the cells themselves are rated for more like 300 amps discharge. So capacity of 320 watt hours, which makes sense at 3.2 volts times 100 amp hours. And I'm assuming this is 4 rows of 5 cells each, which would be 20 cells at probably 5 amp hour nominal, 5 or 5.5 to get the 100 amp hour. So that makes sense. This certainly doesn't say battery hookup on it anywhere, but this looks exactly like a battery hookup module that I have played with. So this was held together by tape with reinforcement in it, and then they put some shrink wrap on top of it. I mentioned earlier that these temperature sensors were just kind of stuffed in here. They were just kind of pushed between the inner and the outer shrink wrap to measure the temperature of the battery. It's unfortunate they're both right in the same place, but I mean, for a $300 battery, that's fine, right? My opinion so far, the only thing that bugs me is the BMS. And to be honest, if you really wanted, considering everything is screw in, you could just pop this open and replace this with another BMS. Okay, so the next test we're gonna do here is the low temperature cutoff. I've got my solar charge controller connected. We're gonna go ahead and turn on the charging, and we'll see here that the wattage starts building, so it's putting a good few hundred watts into there. I've got my chilled ice water here. It's got some salt in there too to try and get the temperature down. So this is below 0 Celsius, which is what we want. It's supposed to cut off at 0 Celsius. So anything below 0 should stop charging. So we'll get one of these temperature sensors into the water here. Not yet. I could do the other temperature sensor as well. Let's see if I can get the other temperature sensor in there. And try not to pour a cup of water to the battery. That'd be good. There we go, that time it cut off. So it could be one of these is the low temperature sensor and one is the high temperature sensor. We'll pull it back out of the water, see if it recovers. Look at that, it recovered. Okay, well, low temperature sensor works. The last piece to this, as you look at my messy workbench getting here to the end, is the high current discharge test. This is supposed to be able to do a 100 amp discharge. And previously, as I tore it down, you saw where I critiqued the fact that there's only 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 Mosfets on here, which doesn't seem sufficient, but I don't actually know, because who knows what kind of Mosfets they have on here. So we've got an inverter set up with about 1,000 watts worth of load. We'll be able to pull 100 amps and see if it can sustain it. So first we'll go ahead and stop our charging so that we're not pulling anything off the solar. So we're down to 0 watts there. And we'll fire up our inverter. Turn on our clamp meter. So that's the box fan we got running here in the background. We also turned on the coffee maker, and we're at 101 amps. Battery is down at 11.8. I probably have about 25%, 30% state of charge on the battery right now. Okay, so that was 2 pots of coffee worth of 100 amps. And we got up to what, 40 Celsius on the Mosfets. I'm okay with that. Honestly, it seemed like the wires themselves were getting just as warm as the Mosfets were. They must be using higher efficiency Mosfets in here versus some of the BMSs that I've used in the past. To be able to have 10 of them and get away with 100 amps, that's very interesting. They don't seem to be getting overly hot, so that's fine. I do like that they've got that little temperature sensor on the Mosfets themselves, which appears that it would cause everything to shut down if the Mosfets get too hot, and then they've got that one on the side of the battery that would do the same thing. Okay, so here we are at the end of our global power. That's what it says, right? Global power. Lithium iron phosphate, 12.8 volt battery. I liked it. We tested the max discharge rate of 100 amps. We were able to do that for about 10-15 minutes. Mosfets got to about 40 degrees Celsius, which I consider reasonable. I don't see a problem with that. We tested the low temperature cutoff. So you can use this in low temperature environments and not kill the cells inside, because once it gets below 0 degrees Celsius, it will cut out, and we tested that and it worked. The actual capacity, it claims 100 amp hours. We measured with our shunt and verified with our clamp meter, got 110 amp hours out of the battery. The one thing that was a little concerning was that the batteries were not top balanced. It could be that they were bottom balanced instead of top balanced, which is kind of odd. Usually you don't do bottom balancing anymore since you've got BMSs. So one of the cells, one of the 4 cells in here, or cell packs, was reaching 3.65 volts before all the rest, and the BMS would cut out. So I would definitely recommend setting the charge controller or inverter charger to charge to 14 volts, not to 14.6. Of course, your battery could be a little bit different than mine. Pay attention to it. What you'll see is a voltage spike. So if you're sitting there watching it and the battery's fully charged and your voltage goes up to like 17 volts and then back down to 14, and then 17 and back down to 14, back and forth, that means that the BMS is cutting out, and that could wreak havoc on things because you're sending that 17 volts into the inverter, and you don't want to do that. That's my opinion on the battery. I like it. This battery is available on eBay. I don't know if it's available elsewhere as well. I do have an affiliate link down in my description. If you want to click that and help me out a little bit in case you were going to buy some, you can. I'm going to go buy 4 more, I think, or 3 more. I guess I've already got one, right? And do a 48 volt setup with a grow watt or something and see how well it works in series. The BMS has spots where you could make it like a 48 volt BMS. So, I mean, obviously, like, it doesn't have the components and stuff, but that tells me the MOSFETs are spec'd for 48 volts. And that's the concern with putting these in series, is whether the MOSFETs can handle shutting off a 48 volt load. And of course it says it can, right? In the manual it says you can do up to 4 in series. What I see on the BMS backs that up. Take that for what you will. But I'm gonna buy some more and see how they work in 48 volt. That's my opinion. I'm gonna go buy some more. Let me know if you think I missed something.